Hey, micro friends! Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I am so happy that you're here with me. And if this is the first time you're listening to Let's Talk Micro, well, thank you for making it one of your podcasts. Okay, and for the benefit of new listeners, we have been going over the past few weeks, we have been doing a series about gram negative cocci. As you know, gram negative cocci, they are very important in the lab, and some of them are very significant. So it is important that we're familiar with them. We know the sources, we know how they look on media, we know the gram stain. Because as we have mentioned before, it can be sometimes a little daunting or scary when we are seeing them on the gram stain, and we might be a little hesitant to report them, right? We don't want to be wrong. We don't want to put the patient in harm, so we want to be careful. And of course, we don't know when that gram negative cocci is going to be seen in the lab in that smear, like in that blood culture or that CSF. It might happen when you're alone in the lab if that is the type of setting that you work under. So the least we can do is try to arm ourselves with knowledge and talk about this. So that's what we have been doing over the past few weeks. And we started with the gram stain. We have talked about sources where you can expect to see gram negative cocci. We have talked about sources where you might see them. We have talked about media. We talked about nucleic acid amplification tests. We talked about ways to identify these gram negative cocci. And in the last episode, we talked about Neisseria gonorrhea and Neisseria meningitis, which have the same gram stain but such a different story, right? Neisseria meningitis, it's a colonizer in up to 10% of young people and it does not cause disease. And then you have Neisseria gonorrhea, which is always a pathogen. It is not normal flora, so it is not normal to have gonorrhea. And we talked about the virulence factors, which they typically center on how the organism, attaches, how it evades the immune response. So we went over that with Neisseria gonorrhea and Neisseria meningitis. And this about being a colonizer, for Neisseria meningitis and not causing disease, we discussed that it is something normal that we see right in microbiology, where we have organisms that are part of the flora of a specific area, and then when they gain access to another part, they cause disease. For example, like Eikenella corrodens is part of the respiratory flora, but if you have something like a bite, then it causes an infection. And another example is Haemophilus influenza, where people have it, are colonized with it, and then it gets transmitted to another person and it causes infection. So this is something that we see that's very common in microbiology. Okay, so we are keeping things organized and we continue going over gram negative cocci. So today we are talking about Moraxella catarrhalis. And in my times as a teacher, I had students pronounce it mozzarella catarrhalis, which is comical, but remember, it is Moraxella. So keep that in mind. And when it comes to Moraxella catarrhalis, this organism, we see it in the lab, and of course, maybe not as frequently as your Enterobacterialis or your Pseudomonas aeruginosa, but we still see it. And to be honest, when it comes to gram negative cocci, the ones that we routinely see are those that we refer to as non pathogenic Neisseria, like Neisseria sicca, for example. And of course, we'll talk more about those later in the podcast. So these organisms that we collectively refer to as non pathogenic Neisseria, we see them in the respiratory bench. Those of you that work with cultures, you know what I'm talking about. And they are part of the respiratory flora. And you see them as this like yellow grayish colonies that sometimes they give the appearance of being beta hemolytic but not quite. It's like you kind of see a little bit of a clearing, and maybe it looks more like an alpha type of hemolysis, but it is definitely not beta. And these organisms, they're very common and you see them quite frequently in the lab. But outside of that, we do tend to see Moraxella catarrhalis more than, let's say, Neisseria gonorrhea or meningitis. So, what have we said about Moraxella catarrhalis so far? Well, it is oxidase positive. It grows well on blood agar and chocolate agar. The colonies are like whitish. And for you students out there, what is peculiar or distinctive about those colonies on the agar? Hint, it is a movement. And by hockey puck, which is what is referred to, and this is something that I can help you correlate things, right? I'm always saying that when you're studying for certification, it always helps associating things with the organisms. And you look for those things in the questions, and it helps you with that. So when you think of Moraxella catarrhalis, you think of hockey puck. And this is that when you touch them with a stick, they slide on the agar. And that's definitely pretty cool, right? One thing to remember is that Moraxella catarrhalis does grow on modified Thayer Martin. So remember that modified Thayer Martin is intended to aid in the recovery of Neisseria gonorrhea and Neisseria meningitis. And we have gone over the components of the agar and why is it selective. So I am not gonna go over that again. So please, go back to the episodes and check that out. But when you have this agar and you see growth, right? And you do a gram stain and you see gram negative cocci, you still have to sub it to another medium like blood agar or chocolate agar so you can properly identify it. Just because something is growing on that modified Thayer Martin does not mean that you have a gram negative cocci. So don't make those assumptions, please. We see that type of thinking sometimes happening with new texts, and that can lead to disaster. So please, if you see something growing on modified Thayer Martin, do a gram stain because it does not mean that you automatically have a gram negative cocci. And even if you do see a gram negative cocci, you still have to sub it because Moraxella catarrhalis, Neisseria lactamica, they both grow on modified Thayer Martin. So please, and I repeat myself often with this, but that thinking of assuming can be very dangerous. So remember, yes, we do have media that has some ingredients, some components that help you in selecting for some organisms, but things happen, and these organisms they don't go to school. So you get organisms growing on that media that maybe is not intended for it, but it happens, right? And we have talked about Pseudomonas aeruginosa PEA. We have talked about yeast on McConkey. So on modified Thayer Martin, you can get other gram-negative organisms growing. So as always, the gram stain is your best friend. So please do not fear the gram stain. Okay, so I digress. So let's keep going on and continue talking about Moraxella catarrhalis. So it does not ferment any of the sugars, right? We talked about that, the acid utilization test for Neisseria, where Neisseria gonorrhea ferments glucose, but not the other sugars, and we went over that. So in this case, Moraxella catarrhalis does not ferment any of them. Okay, so by now we have talked about some of these gram-negative cocci. Some are colonizers, some are always pathogenic, some are part of the respiratory flora. So where does Moraxella catarrhalis fall in this? Okay, so when you go to some references, you see that Moraxella catarrhalis was classified as normal microbiota of the upper respiratory tract, and sometimes there's a little controversy on how much of a pathogen it is. So let's talk about this. So, according to the Manual of Clinical Microbiology from ASM, Moraxella catarrhalis is a human mucosal pathogen and has a pathogenic role in lower respiratory infections. In particular, patients with COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And some infections that are associated with Moraxella catarrhalis are otitis media, sinusitis, and pneumonia. But let's go ahead and talk about whether it is a colonizer or whether it's commensal. So let's spend a little bit of time on this. So in children, this organism is frequently present as a commensal, which is why in patients of this age, where you have, patients with sinusitis or otitis media, if this organism is identified, it cannot be determined if it is the one causing the infection. Now, when it comes to adults, this organism is not a frequent colonizer, which explains the role as a pathogen in those COPD patients because you don't typically see it there in adults. So it makes sense. And then other infections in immunocompromised hosts are endocarditis and septicemia. Okay, so let's talk about virulence. And we did a great episode, as I said before, on Neisseria meningitis and gonorrhea, where we talk about virulence factors. And as you know, these are typically centered on evading the host's immune response, how the organism attaches, and things like that. And when it comes to Moraxella catarrhalis, there is a mention in the Manual of Clinical Microbiology that virulence factors, they have been reviewed. but there is not a lot of information on this. Okay. And for those of you that work on the bench and you work with lower respiratory cultures, by now we have mentioned infections that are associated with Moraxella catarrhalis, right? So if you have something like a sinus culture or if you have an ear culture, these are places, these are samples where you might see some gram-negative cocci, so Moraxella catarrhalis. But getting back to those lower respiratory cultures, when it comes to those, this organism is reported when in significant amounts, even if it is not predominant. So I want to say it again. When it comes to lower respiratory cultures, this organism is reported when in significant amounts, even if it is not predominant. Now, what do we consider as significant growth? So, according to the Clinical Microbiology Procedures Handbook, significant growth is defined as the following. So, when it comes to semi quantitative cultures, it is defined as moderate or abundant, 3 plus and 4 plus growth, or colonies in the first quadrant of the plate if there is little or no other microbiota on the plate. And then when it comes to quantitative cultures, it is defined as greater or equal than 10 to the 4th CFU colony forming units per milliliter for bronchoalveolar lavage cultures and greater or equal than 10 to the 3 CFU per ml for protected brush specimen cultures. So, just to make sure that we are all on the same page, I gave you the definition of what is considered significant growth because this organism, when you have significant growth, you report it even if it is not predominant. Okay, so remember that this organism can be identified using the catarrhalis disc, and we talked about that. So, it is such a simple test, and that means that if you have it, you perform the test, you have a positive result, you can report it as Moraxella catarrhalis without the need of doing something like MALDI or Vitek. And I know that we have not spent time talking about susceptibilities, but typically in the lab, when you identify this organism, I know that maybe you do something like a beta lactamase test and then you report that. However, according to the Clinical Microbiology Procedures Handbook, over 90% of isolates are beta lactamase positive, so this test is not recommended to guide treatment. Okay, so here's another chapter in the story of gram negative cocci, right? So, once again, same gram stain, different story. In this case, an organism that can cause some serious diseases and be part of the flora of young children, but not so much in adults. So, when you see a gram negative diplococci at the bench, think about the patient, the specimen source, and what it means clinically. And that's our goal. Not just identifying the organism, and of course, we need to be very proficient at that, but understanding what it means for the patient. So I hope that you stay tuned as we continue going over this series. And by now, we have gone over some of the main organisms, and we still have to talk more about the non pathogenic Neisseria. So stay tuned. But something that it's very important as microbiologists is make sure that we have as much knowledge as we can. And with this series, I hope that we have achieved that. It's just making us a little bit stronger. So next time that we see that gram negative cocci on the gram stain or on the plate, we feel more confident in making those calls. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. And if you haven't checked out the previous one in the series, go ahead and do so. It is great content and I think it's very beneficial for those of you that work on the bench or want an overall refresher. So check them out. And as always, you can find us on any podcast platform. If you go to Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Good Pods, we are right there. So please subscribe to the podcast, download episodes, and if the app allows you to do so, please leave a review. Thank you so much for the support. And as far as socials, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky Social as Let's Talk Micro, X as Let's Talk Micro 1, LinkedIn as Luis Plaza. Then, of course, there is the website, which is letstalkmicro.com. And there's also an email address, which is letstalkmicro@outlook.com. So either via social media, via email, you can send any feedback, any topic suggestions. They are always welcome and appreciated. And if you go to the website, you can find information on licensing, on study resources, episode updates, and more. If you want to support us in any way, you can do so via Venmo or via Buy Me a Coffee, KOFI, and both links are available on the show notes. And friends, as microbiologists or infectious disease physicians, pharmacists, it is always challenging learning about antibiotics. So if you want to learn more, please check out www.learnantibiotics.com and the Learn Antibiotics book available on Amazon. These resources include cheat sheets, practice tests, games, and more, and they are being used by thousands of people worldwide and may be helpful for you or your colleagues. And these are some great resources from Dr. Timothy Gauthier, a very passionate pharmacist. Okay, and the Let's Talk Micro podcast is supported by the American Society for Microbiology. To learn more about microbes, visit asm.org. And that, micro friends, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy learning about Moraxella catarrhalis. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. Hey, thank you so much for the support. I'm so grateful for it. Thank you for listening. I really enjoy this journey and I enjoy sharing this information. So, thank you. And hey, are you going to ASM Microbe? Because if you are, I will be there too. So stay tuned. I'm working on something. As it gets more concrete, I will go ahead and give you more information. But stay tuned. I'm planning something at ASM Microbe. As always, if you see me there, stop me and say hello. I'm looking forward to meeting you and connecting with you. And something very important, please continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. You do such a great job. So, as always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.